Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation today on development stage investment acquisition rates. My name is Tareen. I'm an attorney here at Frederickson and Byron, and I'm in the technology and data group. And I'm here with my colleagues, Aleida and Jeff Steinle. And Aleida kind of focuses on venture capital and angel financing, M&A and cross-border M&A, international and life sciences. And Jeff also is in the areas of corporate governance, securities, M&A, and life sciences. And all three of us collaborate and work on the types of transactions that we're going to talk about today. That's us. So just a quick moment about our life sciences group. There are 50 of us attorneys that work with life sciences and healthcare companies. We work on M&A transactions, IP, corporate and compliance matters. And on the right there is kind of a quick snapshot of some of the clients we work with on a pretty frequent basis. In 2019, we closed over 80 life sciences M&A transactions. And so a number of the transactions in this area that we're going to talk about today, in our experience, is in life sciences. But not all. So we'll talk a little more broadly about that as well. And then our Surge group, which you've probably heard a little bit more about, and you can learn more about by going to our booth in the exhibition area. Surge stands for Startup and Rapid Growth Enterprise. And there are a number of us who really enjoy working with startup companies. We like working with entrepreneurs who are excited and developing something new. And our work kind of focuses on the entire life cycle of inception to exit, coming up with legal strategies, helping determine risk tolerance, and we really focus on sort of practical business-centered advice for clients. And we really enjoy working with technology companies and startups because, as we affectionately say, we often refer to these clients as sort of cowboys and cowgirls out there taking risks, and we really enjoy working with kind of cowboys and cowgirls and being their lawyers. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to talk about our agenda today.
Yeah, so our topic is pretty specific, and it's a type of structured transaction that we're really seeing a lot of more recently. So our agenda today is really going to be discussing when and why these structured acquisitions or development stage investments, plus some right for acquisition when they're used, walking through the economic, legal structure, and strategic considerations of doing these deals, and then talking a little bit about some potential complications and watch-outs for these transactions. So kind of the first case is why are these types of deals used? So what we see often within the tech communities and particularly within the med tech and life sciences communities are large acquirers or consolidators in the industry who really are looking at new technologies. And then a whole constellation of startup activity, but the startups are really early stage. So the startup needs investment dollars. It sometimes needs a strategic partner. It needs some amount of investment as it drives towards developing a proof of concept or a proof of success in the marketplace. Acquirers, in the meantime, are perhaps a little bit less nimble, a little slower. And they're really looking for kind of that entrepreneurial capability within the startup community, but they're not. So they want to lock up the technology and lock up the rights, but they're not quite ready to pull the trigger right now. And then a lot of times in these cases, they're also worried about a bear investment or some lesser strategic rights like a board observer, or a right of first refusal, or right of first negotiation. Because if a competitor comes in, that competitor can jump the deal. So that's kind of what leads us to this, kind of defined option where we have a definite option to buy the company. So the rationale for these deals is, number one, from the buyer perspective, they're not spending R&D dollars. They're not spending, they don't have P&L exposure. They can kind of leave that all at the startup. They're providing an investment, so it reduces the risk for both the buyer as well as the seller. You kind of get this try before you buy type ability as well. Particularly, Ozma will be talking a little bit about some of the more collaboration type things that we do with startups. And so it's an ability for those two parties to get to know each other. From a buyer perspective, they know they've got a partner to buy. And from a seller perspective, they've got the certainty of having a strategic partner, so there's less risk involved. There might be some cap on the upside for the deal because they're not going to market when the technology is really hot, but the risk is reduced. So sometimes that's a fine trade-off. And the financing, the way it can work out sometimes is that it's non-dilutive financing as well. So in medtech, the reason that we see these, first of all, there's kind of these, well-defined triggers. A lot of times it's FDA approval or some kind of geographic expansion. So we've seen these in the strategic sectors quite a bit. Aleida and I right now are working on one in the private equity sector, which is a little bit more of a, the private equity group in this case is kind of, serving as a venture capital investor early stage, but then has rights to acquire the rest of the company as they go. So I think you'll probably see an expansion of this, outside of just the strategics into the broader PE sector as well. Usually for these types of companies, IP is an important factor. So in other words, the buyer is really looking to lock up the IP, early on and provide some investments to kind of nurture the technology. And then, Ozma will be talking a little bit later that there's a lot of ways that the two companies can work together. A lot of times by, the larger strategic company providing some level of support on, collaboration or R&D or the like, or distribution, early on to kind of help speed development of the company's market or its technology. And then, of course, the final one is, most startups are, spend a, exorbitant amount of time looking for cash. So there's that need, and they've got a source of cash that they can use as they move forward. So, this kind of summarizes what I just talked about. The key ingredients for one of these to really work is you've got a target company or startup that, needs cash, they're looking for an investor. There's some kind of current desire for some kind of collaboration, whether that's R&D, joint development type agreement, or a licensing agreement, or a distribution agreement, or the like. And then you really anticipate in the future that something's going to happen in the company. Again, in my sphere, I do a lot of medtech deals, be it FDA approval. In this PE deal that Aleida and I are working on, it's really more of a market expansion, kind of anticipating inflection point. So we think that's going to happen in the future, but they're not quite ripe for the acquisition today. So these are complicated, forward-looking, deals. You're kind of, not to be too, science fiction, but, there's a little bit of, you think about the space-time continuum. This is a little bit more of the, development time or money time continuum, that we work through on these deals. So I'm going to transition to Aleida, and she's going to kind of talk about the types and structures of these deals that we see.
Yep. So as Jeff alluded to, you're essentially negotiating 3 deals at the same time. When you're coming into these transactions, you've got your typical investment that's going to bring in that cash infusion at the outset, be it a convertible note or your typical seed or series, whatever investment. And you will have those transaction documents. You'll have some sort of collaboration between the strategic buyer or, whoever the buyer is and your company. And that can take the form, depending where you're at, of a license agreement or a collaboration agreement, maybe even a distribution agreement. And then you're at the same time negotiating your eventual exit. So what does this look like in practice. The buyer will come in and make an upfront payment, and that's going to be, it could be a standard loan, it could be convertible note, or it could be an equity investment. That's going to get you the operating cash that you need at the outset to continue developing your company. In exchange for that, in addition to the equity, if it's an equity investment, the buyer is going to get a right to acquire your company at some point in the future. And that's typically milestone based. Jeff mentioned a couple of different scenarios that you can see there. It could be some kind of regulatory approval. It could be revenue based. But you're negotiating that at the outset here. Sometimes that right is, or most of the time, that's going to be an option for the buyer. Sometimes you do, as a company, get the right to require your buyer to exercise on that, but that's, I'd say, much less typical. Typically in connection with this, you also agree on some commercial relationship. This buyer's coming in because they've got expertise in the market that you don't have, and they can provide help in moving forward operations. And Osman will talk about those agreements a little bit more. So what do the parties want to get out of this? The buyers, they want to know that there's a deal at the end of this, but as Jeff said, they don't want to take the P&L hit yet because the company is so early stage. And so they want the certainty, but don't necessarily need to be locked in yet, don't want to buy the company yet. And that's why we see it structured as an option often, because they do want the ability to back out if your company doesn't perform the way that everybody expects it to. On the flip side, as a seller, you want as much certainty as possible, and as much you want to know that this option is going to get exercised, and if you're giving these rights, that you're going to be able to sell when you are ready and when you hit that milestone. You also need cash now, and you need that strategic partnership. And the other piece of that is that you do know that you're giving up, you're capping your upside essentially, and so you do want a little bit of a premium for that. And so that's a mix of not necessarily aligned interests that you have to negotiate for, and make sure that you're covering gaps so that when you get to that milestone event, you're not, you haven't missed something that blows up your whole deal. The idea is you want to get to a deal at the end here. That can take a variety of different forms. And so some of the times, I'd say maybe most of the time, Jeff, or about half the time, we see the fully baked self-executing transaction. And what that means is at the time of that initial cash infusion, you are also negotiating your full-blown agreement that's going to be, that's going to affect the exit. And so you're thinking about what representations and warranties your company is going to give, what you're going to be on the hook for as selling shareholders in the event of some risk that was unforeseen, how the company is going to be operating between the time this option is signed and exercised. And so when you get to that milestone, it's pretty much just mechanics. Once the buyer decides to exercise, there's not a ton that should be negotiated at that point. It's executing on an agreement that you've already signed. The next level down from that is more of a term sheet style, which will set out most of the key terms that will get you that will apply on an exit, but not a full-blown agreement. And so when you get to the milestone period, you might have maybe a formula for how you're going to have the purchase price laid out, but not a baked-in purchase price, or an idea about what kind of indemnification provisions are going to be in the agreement, but not all of the language that we typically see. And so there's a little bit more negotiation there. There's a little bit more room for the deal to fall apart. Obviously, if you can get the fully baked agreement, oftentimes that's the preference of the parties because it has more certainty with it. If you have to go with a term sheet, just make sure that you're lining up on the key terms that are going to be negotiated later, so that you don't see your deal falling apart because you didn't tackle something at the outset. It's better to talk about it on the front end, make sure you're on the same page, than punt until later and then have your deal fall apart. And then, as Jeff said, we're seeing PE get involved in these types of deals a little bit more, and they're sometimes more attractive path for them is not a cash outlay with an option to acquire 100%, but maybe a 20% and then a follow-on 40%, and eventually they get to majority, versus the two-stage setup that we've been discussing. All right, considerations. We talked about this can be structured as debt, it can be equity or convertible debt. It can be your initial cash outlay can be in one lump sum, or it can be split into different milestones where, the initial investment is made upon, first trial result, and then the next set of payments comes in on a second milestone. Or it could be, just the full investment at the front with the acquisition option upon one milestone. And we'll get into these a little bit more, but once you sign that agreement with an acquisition option, there will be restrictions on what you can and can't do between the time you sign and when that milestone happens, particularly if you've got equity. But even on the debt side, that buyer wants to know that they're going to be repaid, and if it's equity, they've made an investment, so they want to make sure that they are have some governance control, that they are being able to look into what the company is doing during that option period to sort of preserve their rights in the option and make sure that's all going well. And sometimes that can impact your fundraising. So that's where it's really important for you, other than obviously the operating covenants that Jeff will get into a little bit more. And with that, Jeff will also talk about valuation and how you value a company in this early of a stage.
Yeah, and this is, so when you think about these deals, in a lot of cases, what you're doing is really agreeing on some things that are going to happen in the future. And as my preference is always to have as much of a fully baked and self-executing agreement as you can right when you sign the deal. And the reason I like that is because I think it creates a lot of certainty, or creates more certainty, both for the buyer as well as for the seller. The term sheet approach that Aleida mentioned, we certainly have done and do. I saw these more, probably 10, 15 years ago, where you'd kind of have what I would call a bare option, with a lot of the terms kind of left to negotiation, or taking a kick the can down the road approach. But you still leave a lot of certainty on the table, as opposed to having a fully blown merger agreement at the time when the investment comes in and you execute the deal. And in those cases, it's a little bit weird to negotiate some of the deal terms when the transaction likely isn't going to be happening for another year, sometimes 2 years, sometimes 5 years down the road. But when you reach that point, there's a beauty in literally just flipping a switch, and the acquisition happens, the wire transfers get made, and it's really simple, and there's a lot more certainty. The reason you don't do that is because of either the time duration of negotiating all those points. It's just too hard to think about some of the terms that are going to be occurring in the future, or because you don't want to candidly spend the legal money. One of those kind of hard things to deal with is the concept of valuation. I mean, so that's hard enough anyway in a early stage investment, pricing your per share price. In these deals, you're thinking about what your prices of your investment going in, and you're also thinking about what am I going to sell this company for? What's it going to be worth 2 or 3 years from now? So as a result of that, and I had a stint doing corporate development for one of the large med techs in town, so I'd think about this a lot. Some of the traditional, discounted cash flow, or kind of market buildup type valuation methodologies are really difficult to do, because you don't know what the market competitors are going to look like. You don't know what the landscape is going to look like. in a lot of cases, you don't even know how, you have less kind of a viewpoint on how big the market will be at that time. Some of the more sophisticated, algorithm-based valuation models like a Monte Carlo and sensitivity analysis provides a little bit more comfort because you can kind of build in some binary, touch points on what happens. But that's also a little bit hard and a lot of guesswork. Comps, aren't always relevant because again, you're taking your valuation comparables from today and trying to apply them to something that's going to happen a couple of years from now as technology is rapidly evolving. So that's difficult as well. So probably no surprise in these deals, we end up using a lot more, milestone payments and earnouts kind of to leverage some of those valuation gaps. I think it's much more likely in these structured acquisitions to have some kind of earnout or milestone, or even have that buyout be entirely, like in the case of, a private equity type deal, have it be a formula-based buyout based on revenue of the company in the future. So we're seeing that a lot. From an acquirer perspective, of course, the backstop is to say, hey, we don't think, we have an option to buy you for $500 million. We don't, at the time you exercise the option to renegotiate that price and back away. But what the risk of that is that it opens up the the potential for a competitive deal and have one of the, as a buyer, having one of your competitors jump in and try to buy your targeted company away from you. And that's after you've invested time and money into the company. So that's not entirely satisfactory either. This is just some data, and this is, a little bit dated right now, but I think this continues to be true. In the world that we see for life science deals, as a result of that, the use of earnouts or kind of these valuation bridges are much more prevalent. We're seeing them, med device, they're, nearly all the deals have some kind of valuation bridge based on an earnout. And that compares to, kind of non-life science deals where, they're kind of hovering right around in the, high teens for the number of deals. So not quite as many of them. I think there's, still room for that in a structured acquisition for a non-life science deal, especially when there's a, question about valuation in the future. But it just serves as a really nice bridge to kind of figure out or have the parties reach agreement now, for something that's going to happen quite a bit in the future. So I'm going to flip it back to Aleida, and she's going to talk about some of the other kind of risk allocations on these deals.
So whether you're negotiating that full-blown agreement or the term sheet, these are risk allocation items that you're going to want to consider and bake into either of those documents. And when you think about whether this event is going to occur, the milestone event is going to occur, you have to think about what happens if it doesn't occur, or what are the parties' rights going to be if you don't get to an exit. One of the issues with, Jeff want to maybe hit the trigger out?
Yeah, no, I'll hit this a little bit as we go through, and we can kind of tag team this a bit. So kind of the first one is really negotiating kind of what the trigger is for how that milestone gets hit, and then what the and then as a seller, kind of what your out is. In other words, at what point do you not have to do the deal? The other thing, and this kind of goes a little bit to the earnout concept that I talked about before, is you can have different exercise prices for different earnouts. We talked about the kind of the traditional earnouts before. I think, one thing that's really kind of helpful to think about is what are the obligations on the buyer to try to hit that? And again, you're negotiating this commercial obligation for something that's going to happen in the future. When I represent the buyer, we spend a lot of effort really trying to minimize the kind of the requirements on the buyer, to have some kind of commitment on how they're going to commercialize the product. The option exercise period, that's kind of, once that trigger is hit, whether it's FDA approval or some technology approval, we end up, spending a lot of time, or the buyer will want more time to kind of pull the trigger on that exercise period. So they've got more time to think about it candidly and kind of reassess the market. The seller will want that period to be quite a bit shorter. So that's a negotiation period. And then the indemnity package, and Aleida, you've seen a lot of these too, that ends up being difficult because, you're trying to negotiate an indemnity package for stuff that you just don't know what's going to happen in the future.
And Jeff, maybe I'll just chime in here. Sometimes we see risk mitigation strategies in the commercial agreements too. So if you've got the buyer investing in getting regulatory approvals for a product, we've seen on the buyer side, clients want to negotiate and say, well, there's some remedies. If you don't actually get to approval or if we don't buy, we're going to be able to recoup some of those costs that we've invested.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then, this is going to be a nice bridge, I think, to, what Ozma will talk about in just a minute. But, there's a whole number of, you've signed your option deal, you've brought in your investment. How are the companies working together over that time period? So, we spend a lot of time negotiating kind of the pre-option exercise, operating covenants, and that's, is there an observation right on the board? Is there a tech committee? And Ozma will talk about that a little bit more. The buyer's really interested in what the IP rights look like. They may be interested in some key employees. They probably don't want the target company to do some significant, corporate things, that might make them less interested in buying the company down the road. So there's kind of a whole host of covenants that we end up negotiating that, that again, you're thinking about, it's like, all right, if I want to buy this company in the future, what do I want to make sure they're doing and make sure they're not doing without my consent prior to, just so that I'm preserving the right of buying the company. And then as the seller, you want as much flexibility, particularly operationally, to be able to manage your company and operate it as you're going forward. So there's a lot of, I don't know if you have any, kind of other observations, but there's a lot of tension between this, what can the target company do and how much have they kind of shifted over to the buyer during this time period?
Yeah, and particularly if they've got, if they already have governance rights pursuant to the equity investment that they've made, then you're layering these on as well.
Yep. All right.
I'll talk a little bit about a couple of the types of commercial agreements that we typically work on then. One of the three types of deals that we're negotiating in all at the same time. The first one, and one that we deal with pretty frequently, is sort of a development agreement collaboration. And the goal, of course, is the buyer and seller collaborating to either further develop a product. So in the med tech space, trying to get regulatory approvals for a new indication or in a new geography, or expanding the product or service. So if the buyer has a pretty good supply chain or a sales force out there, they may want to try to expand the product into a different territory. So these agreements, I would say, are the most fun part of these deals. And I'm biased because I work on these, but it really, I think for the business team, is also fun because it is what's familiar, it's what you're excited about. So we're talking about the product. And similar to a standalone development agreement, we're really going to kind of get into the guts of, all right, well, what is the product and what's the goal for development? What are the goals we're trying to achieve? And getting into really outlining a development process. So what are each party's obligations? What's each party bringing to the table? So typically the buyer is going to invest money. And so they're going to we're going to set up kind of parameters in the agreement of, again, tied to milestones. When are certain payments going to be due, or how is that going to be funded? So again, in the med tech space, typically we're dealing with medical devices, and those milestones are easy to identify because it's perhaps funding of a clinical trial. We can tie milestones to receipt of certain regulatory approvals. But we've also seen in the software space, I recently worked on a transaction where there was a hosted platform service for a certain industry, and buyers said, okay, well, we think we can expand this to a different industry, but we want to build some integrations to be able to expand the scope and use of this platform. And so then it was very much like a traditional software development agreement, sort of testing and acceptance, and the parties first sitting down and creating parameters. So what are the product requirements and the specifications, and what does it need to do to work for this other industry? And a very collaborative process that's going to require both parties to be involved in the development, the testing, acceptance. The go live then would be a logical milestone. So those are the kinds of things we negotiate. Again, as Jeff and Aleida said, the IP becomes a big issue. And typically for the seller, we want to take the position, that we own anything that we're developing related to our product. It's kind of derivative or an expansion of our product. And we as the seller should continue to own that. And usually from the buyer's perspective, that's fine, because ultimately when they exercise their option, they're going to have the rights that they need and acquire essentially all rights. But it is something that gets highly negotiated, and we've seen buyers insist that they want to sort of hold on to ownership of something that they've developed until they exercise the option, or some other milestone, or if there's something that they can essentially sort of break away and take with them if they don't exercise the option, then IP rights become highly negotiable in that scenario. Another type of agreement, commercial agreement, that we often deal with in these transactions are distribution or supply agreements. So again, this is with tangible products, most often in medical device. And again, so for an investor, oftentimes, if you've got a large medical technology company, again, they've already got the supply chain developed, they've got a sales force, and they may say, well, we're going to invest in regulatory approvals for this additional indication for your product. And once that product is approved, we want rights to be able to distribute and sell that product through our sales force. And so again, we're negotiating kind of the field of use, the territory in which the buyer may have those distribution rights. And Jeff and Aleida talked about kind of uncertainty for certain things looking into the future that are very hard to set. And one of those is transfer price, so the sale of the actual product. So in your typical product manufacturing or supplier distribution agreement, it's pretty easy to peg to a price. Here, we're often in the medtech space looking 4 or 5 years into the future and trying to guess what the price is going to be for a product, which is pretty difficult to do. So oftentimes we end up in the situation where we're trying to create a mechanism for trying to peg that price, and a process, again, with stakeholders on both sides who are going to sit down and come to agreement on what that price is going to be under some kind of supply and distribution agreement. And those provisions can be sometimes a kick the can down the road sort of scenario. We'll sit down and we'll come to an agreement in 4 years, or it could be pages of process of here's what the baseline is going to be. It's going to be a percentage, or it's going to be tied to the current product as it's sold, but with some different factors built in. So that's one of those that's difficult. Typically, as the investor buyer, if they are getting exclusive rights in a territory, it's going to come along with some kind of minimum sales obligations. And then all of the typical types of terms that you would see in a supply and distribution agreement for forecasting, order fulfillment, dealing with defective product, those are all going to be included in these types of agreements. And then finally, a third type of agreement, and this may be built into one of the other two, is kind of something for the ongoing support and development of the product. And so if it's software, there may be ongoing, improvements, updates, and support that's required. And this is typically something that makes sense to negotiate upfront. It might be, again, kind of deferring to the future under a statement of work process and saying, well, here's what the financial terms of that are going to be. And typically, both parties have an interest in setting very clear parameters for like what's in the scope of the initial development, support, help for the product, and then what's outside of that and is going to cost more money under a statement of work, typically on a time and materials basis. So we see these agreements sometimes are engineering agreements, engineering support, and again, kind of an ongoing services agreement that contemplates what's going to happen in the future after those initial milestones have been met. So maintaining regulatory approvals, whatever other steps need to be taken. And the IP issues here are typically just an extension of what we would have negotiated in the development agreement. That typically if the seller is going to own the IP, they're going to probably continue to own the new stuff, again, until that option is exercised. So that takes us to kind of closing and terminating considerations.
Yeah. So, and I'll, maybe I'll pull us back a little bit and just give an example, of one, deal that, we're working on right now. So it's kind of a, we're representing a seller on this deal. It's a, classic, almost, more traditional kind of med tech product in this case. So we have a European buyer, we have a Minnesota-based startup, that's developed this product, and we're in the midst of negotiating what the option is going to look like, and it's a, significant exit of this company will likely be in 2 years, and it assumes that they get FDA approval for the product. So what we're thinking through right now is it's like, all right, well, what happens if that option doesn't get exercised? Because in this case, our, the buyer, the party opposite our client, they are really, looking at, potential blockbuster, med device product, that is, would be life-changing for a lot of people. Everybody believes that this product has, great upside in the marketplace. But, buyers, perspectives change. So we're doing a lot of thinking about what happens if they don't buy it. Who else can we go to? What is, we've got a distribution agreement we're negotiating in the middle. Does that get terminated? Kind of what happens? Do we need to go out and get more funds? Like, what is that going to look like in the event that we terminate? Because our buyer in this case could. And then the other thing that you have to think about too, conversely, in the event that they close, we've got a group of shareholders that will all need to vote on this transaction right now. So 2 years from now, who approves that deal, when it gets negotiated at that point? Are there things that the board can say, yeah, we didn't negotiate this, back in 2020. So as a result of that, if we don't get the term that I want here, we get to terminate. And then kind of what's the discretion that the board has to make that decision at that point? And is there any additional shareholder approval that you need at that point, or is it locked up? In this case, we're doing the lockup through a voting agreement. Antitrust approvals, an additional hurdle, because, right now the product is not competitive. We're not anticipating any antitrust problems at all. But we don't know what the buyer is, what other, companies they might acquire in the interim that could cause a regulator, an antitrust regulator, either in the US or in Europe in this case, to have problems with the transaction. And then the other question is, if the company needs additional unanticipated funding from someone other than the option holder between now and when we sell the company, do those new investors, do they also need to approve the deal, and how are you structuring that? And then the final one is, if we materially change the terms, like in this case, we're using a term sheet for the acquisition, but if, things change and we negotiate different terms, or the buyer demands different terms in that term sheet, at what point does that trigger a need to go back and have another vote by the shareholders because that transaction has changed? So these are all the things, and again, it kind of goes to that that time duration and uncertainty element that you're kind of negotiating, not just what the deal looks like today, but what you anticipate the deal will look like in the future, and kind of what those changes could be, which makes these types of transactions, kind of complicated, but also kind of fun too. So, I think the key takeaways, from this presentation, when you do one of these, investment deals with an option to acquire, really think about it in terms of, if you're selling a sale of your company right from the beginning. If you're a buyer, think about it in terms of doing all the diligence that you would want to do and making sure that you're satisfied that you can buy the company in the future. As opposed to some, investments that are more passive, this is definitely one that you want to be active with. So if you're a acquirer, stay close to your target company through the collaborations that Ozma talked about, or through some of the, the covenants and the governance rights that you have. Think about what happens. Number 3 is, what are those kind of walkaway rights, and what do you do if that option isn't exercised? Critically important for the selling company to kind of plan for a plan B. And then, we talked a bit about earnouts and kind of some of these valuation bridges. Those get litigated all the time. I'm, unfortunately working on a couple of transactions right now where, there's a question, the earnout, in this case, the revenue earnout wasn't met. In 2020, there's, rationale for that in this case because it was an elective procedure that was shut down due to COVID for 2 months, so they missed the revenue target by about $4 million. So we're litigating over that today. We think we've got unambiguous language that milestone, in that case for the buyer, that the milestone wasn't hit, so we don't have to pay the earnout. But using unambiguous language is really helpful for both sides just to avoid litigation. And then kind of the last one is really trying to set this up as much as you can. We always recommend, bringing your lawyers in early for, the letter of intent and really being clear on what the parties intend. And then, you get more certainty. It takes more time and, and a little bit more work on the legal side to do a full-blown acquisition agreement. But it really ends up giving everybody more certainty as they go forward. So, kind of our closing cartoon here, it's kind of the classic lawyer thing. A lot of times the business folks really, have the deal worked out. Sometimes I think we, create more questions and complications, or at least our business counterparts sometimes think we do. But you're really thinking about this as, kind of taking that business deal or that handshake deal and working it out over this, multi-year duration to get to a closing is again complicated, kind of fun. Hopefully we don't create more questions than providing answers. So that's our presentation. I think we might have a minute or two. If there's a chat function, we can see if we have any questions. All right. And Ozma, Aleida, anything to add? All right.
Thanks for
If
having
not,
us.
yeah.
Check out our booth in the expo.
All right. Thank you all.